Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
We're delighted to see you all joining us. And if you would be so kind as to let us know where you're joining from, even just your place in the world, as much information as you'd like in that chat box, we'd love to see it. We'll be getting started here in just a minute. We have one of our panelists is having a little trouble logging on. So we're making sure that happens. So give us just a minute here. Oh, wonderful. People from the Rural Legal Advocates. Excellent. Welcome, welcome. New Jersey and Texas and New York, North Dakota, DC. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Louise, welcome.
Hi. I finally managed to log in.
Oh, I'm so glad you did it. You made it. So we have Greece, wonderful, welcome, and the UK and Italy, oh, wonderful. Excellent, the Netherlands.
We also have one person from India.
You have someone from India? Oh, we have a question here already? Okay.
No, that's Bharat from Vishakha.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, Bharat. Hello, Bharat, nice to see you. Okay, now we'll get started here. So, welcome everyone. My name is Cheryl Thomas, and I am with Global Rights for Women in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we're just delighted to see all of you joining us. We have over 300 registrants for our webinar, and so just really thrilled at that interest in this really deeply important issue. So I am the moderator, and I am going to ask Nazifa Wazirzada, my associate here at Global Rights for Women, to go over the website webinar logistics first.
Hello, yes, hello everyone. My name is Nazifa. I am the program coordinator here at Global Rights for Women. And just a few logistics to start off. Feel free to type your questions into the chat box throughout the presentation. And Laura Wilson, our moderator and attorney, will pose your questions. And just as a reminder, a recording of the presentation and the webinar will be sent to all of you so you can view it afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nazifa. For those joining, I see more are joining. Welcome, welcome. My name is Cheryl Thomas. I am the Executive Director of Global Rights for Women. We would love to see if you would, where you're from. If you would put that in the chat box, it's nice for not only the panelists, but also all of those who are joining us to see that. Just a little bit about Global Rights for Women. We are the host of this webinar along with Global Women Fresh, and we're really honored to do this. I was just telling the other panelists, Global Women Fresh is a network of all these businesses who care about women's human rights, and I'll let them talk about that a little more, but this webinar was inspired by them reaching out to us during this time of COVID. We're concerned about women's lives and violence against women in women's lives. So that's how this all began. Global Rights for Women, our organization is based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we work with partners around the world to advance women and girls' human right to be free from violence. We do a lot with legal reform, laws, training, capacity building, of police and prosecutors and judges and probation and advocates, and work always in partnership and only at the invitation of folks in other countries who have similar missions and a similar vision for the world. So Julie, were you able to join us and talk a little bit about Global Women Fresh? And Julie Escobar, did we have, okay, well, why don't we, Lorena, would you like to say a few words about it, or shall we just, Julie may be having a little trouble joining.
Can you hear me now?
We can, thank you, Julie. Yes.
Awesome.
Your wonderful network.
Awesome. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for anyone and everyone in the chat today in this virtual webinar. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Cheryl, for allowing us to partner with Global Rights for Women in this great initiative. Very briefly, Global Women Fresh is also a non-for-profit organization that looks to inspire, empower, and connect women in the agricultural business around the world. And we are really thrilled to be here today and creating awareness within the private sector, and hopefully trying to create a lot more initiatives within companies to tackle this very important topic. So excited to be here, and really looking forward to connect with this amazing global network.
Well, we're just thrilled to have you, Julie. After all, this webinar was your idea, so thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
And now you're coming to us from where this morning, Julie?
I'm based in Oregon, but all our entire audience from Global Women Fresh should be extremely global. We have people from Italy, from the Netherlands, from India, from South America.
Wonderful, just wonderful. Welcome, welcome to all of you. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and introduce our panelists? And I would love it if we could start with Kalliopi and say a little bit about yourself, Kalliopi.
Hello, colleagues. I'm so honored to be a part of this really very interesting panel with such distinguished women and sisters from around the world. Thank you very much for giving the opportunity to UN Women to participate. I'm Kalliopi Mingierou. I'm a Greek national. Welcome to my Greek fellows who joined the webinar this morning. I'm based in New York City, a very troubled New York City right now in Brooklyn. And I'm the chief of the Ending Violence Against Women section at the headquarters of UN Women. Global Rights for Women is a very good partner of UN Women. And during COVID-19, UN Women has really accelerated its efforts to work in the areas of policy, programs, and advocacy to governments to address violence against women and girls, which has been exacerbated during the lockdown, as we will hear during this discussion. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Kalliopi. Poonam. You're muted, Poonam. No worries.
So my name is Poonam Kathuria, and I'm the founder director of Society for Women's Action and Training Initiatives. We are a feminist organization working in the state of Gujurat in India. I do know that one person is here from India, but I hope there are many more, and I would love to hear from you here later. So my role at SWATI essentially is, I would like to say that, is to essentially make it succeed. And I say that purposefully because there are a lot of entrepreneurs here, and most entrepreneurs, the role is to make the organization succeed. Prevention of violence against women is a core objective of SWATI. The reason we work on violence against women is because working on violence and analyzing its causes provides us a lens through which to analyze and question patriarchy, the unequal power relationships between men and women, and the institution of family and marriage itself, the way it is structured, and also the intimate partner relationships that we very often not necessarily experience in India, but I think the rest of the world, intimate partner violence is much more common. We recognize that violence against women is a complex phenomenon, and we need to work with it at several levels. I particularly say that because today I think we are going to be advocating with you as to how you as entrepreneurs, how as you as business people can bring this issue within your organizations and be working with it. So we work in a systems approach with the understanding that it is more sustainable and long-term as compared to working with individuals. We thus work with health systems on making health systems responsive to violence against women. We work with governance systems, with municipalities and corporations to make them gender responsive and responsive to violence against women. And most importantly, we work with communities. We work through women's leadership, and we have created what we call gender just committees. These are committees under women's leadership who work on issues of violence against women. We work in a multi-agency coordination approach and provide counseling, legal aid, and other survivor support services, which women who are facing domestic violence may need. I'll just stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Poonam. And let's be sure to remember later on in the presentation to tell about what's happening tomorrow in India that you mentioned to us. Louise, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hello everyone. Once again, thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. I'm really honored. I'm Louise and I'm a graduate in a master's which was called Gender Analysis and International Development from the University of East Anglia in the UK. And I graduated in October, and now I am back in France, which is my home. And I was here during the coronavirus outbreak and during the lockdown, so I'll be talking about the case of France. Last summer, I had the chance to intern at SWATI with Poonam. Thank you again, Poonam, for having me during the summer. And I wrote my dissertation, my master's dissertation, on the impact and the role of a survivor support group for victims of domestic violence. And I also, when I was back in the UK, volunteered at a women's refuge where I helped to organize activities for women and the interaction between women and children, and to generally boost the morale in the refuge. And this is something which is really a passion for me, because I think women's self-esteem, and especially survivors' self-esteem, is really key. Everyone needs to speak up, because speaking up is what leads to activism, and which in turn leads to policies to tackle domestic violence. So thank you again for everything, everyone who's here.
Thank you so much, Louise. France has been so much in the news during this COVID crisis, so we're really eager to hear. And Lorena,
youth voice. I think Louise is the youth voice on this platform.
I seem to be the youngest here, yes.
Yes, and fabulous. Your perspective is just essential. Thank you so much, Louise, for joining us. And Lorena.
Hi, everybody. It's more than a pleasure to be here. I am not only delighted, but very proud to be a panelist and be sharing our experience, our perspectives, and our jobs with the world, especially through the best creative power there is, women. So I will talk briefly about myself. I am the founder of organic superfood company. We started 10 years ago in Peru. We work with fresh superfoods from the Amazon, and that gave origin to a project that I oversee, which is providing more opportunity, economic opportunity for women in the jungle to expose their products in the markets that we already are present in, mainly United States and Europe. Professionally, I am a sustainability strategist, work closely with companies and public institutions, especially in Peru, to implement sustainability practices through eco-efficiency. And one of the key points here that I think is very important, it's the work that we're doing as Women of Light Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that impacted already the life of 2,000 women worldwide. We're present in 9 countries. And what we're doing is we're bringing specific tools to women that need them, because we can have lack of regulations, or we can have regulations, but if women don't have their own tools to empower themselves, we find that it's very hard for recovery. So through breathing techniques, meditations, and yoga, we are providing strategies for physical, mental, and of course, spiritual development, so these women can transform themselves and also their communities. thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to a great session.
Me too. Thank you so much for joining us, Lorena. And Julie, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And I apologize, for some reason my video is not working yet. Yeah, so I've been in the agricultural business for over 20 years. My current full-time job is I'm the vice president of a private equity group where we do a lot of impact investments, in not only in the US, but also in Latin America as well as Australia. And president of Global Women Fresh, and which is an organization that, as I said at the beginning, we've been in the business for over 2 years now. So could you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes, and now we can
Yeah.
see you. Excellent.
Oh, awesome. Beautiful. Excellent.
And you are originally from Colombia.
Yes, originally from Colombia, and my career has been really international, and I've had the pleasure to travel and live extensively in the Asia Pacific Rim, in Latin America, as well as Europe. So have been extremely connected to the realities of women, and one of the biggest reasons of why we decided, in other two co-founders, Monica Bratuti and Vivian Chapo, to co-found Global Women Fresh, was with the incredible need that we have of elevating women at every level of the supply chain in the agricultural business. Not only do we have a need for more executive women, but also we have a need to really support the women in the front line, the women who are actually feeding us today. So once again, we're delighted to be here and excited to spend the next hour and a half with this team.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julie. And just quickly about myself, I'm the founder of Global Rights for Women. Before that, I began my work in women's international human rights in 1992, and that was before the United Nations had said women's rights are human rights, and violence against women is a human rights violation. It's been absolutely a thrill to see the progress that's been made in these almost 30 years. Had the great privilege of working on many of the laws, model law with the UN, the model legislation on sexual violence and domestic violence, and just be a resource for many incredible women's advocates around the world in drafting their first laws on domestic violence. Over these last 30 years, many of these laws are new. Some of you may know. So let's move along here. I know that these incredible panelists are such a resource for us now. So we have, these women are on the front lines of serving domestic violence victims and caring about women workers and how violence affects them. You have policymakers here, founders of first women's organizations. So please be sure to direct your questions to the chat box. My colleague, Laura Wilson, will be making sure that we address those. Our goals here today, just for all of us to kind of keep in mind, keep the panelists focused, of course, and then also just make sure you know what we're trying to accomplish here is I do see that there are some domestic violence practitioners, violence against women practitioners, whether you're advocates or people that are working in other ways in the field, but also many of you who may not be so steeped in the knowledge about the dynamics of domestic violence and the global pandemic of violence against women and girls. So we want to, it's a steep task we have here, but we are going to try to increase your knowledge about that. That's our goal, this global pandemic and the dynamics themselves. And then also address how this problem has been exacerbated during COVID isolation, and how that really, it makes sense because isolation is so very much a part of the tactic that abusers use to continue their violence against victim survivors. And then, of course, because so many of you are coming to this from your employer perspective, from the Global Fresh network to offer you information about promising workplace policies that can promote the rights of domestic violence victims. And we're going to touch on what there was there during pre-COVID, and then talk about what is emerging as best practices during COVID. So as Nazifa said, and I said, please don't hesitate to use your chat and make sure that we're getting your questions answered or following up with them after the webinar. So we can go on to the next slide. I'm just going to introduce this information and ask particularly Kalliopi and Poonam to jump in here. Violence against women and girls is, as I said, a global pandemic. It's been identified by Special Rapporteur at the UN, the Secretary General. It is the most common form of violence is intimate partner violence. So those people that women know are so often the perpetrators of this violence. Studies have come out in recent years finally documenting this. These are studies we didn't have really 15, 20 years ago in most of the world. We still know that 600 million women live in countries where domestic violence is not a crime. There may be some remedies for it, but in so much of the world, there is rampant impunity for domestic violence. It is still considered a private matter. And I know all the women on the panelists here are really interested in changing that. So Poonam, Kalliopi, do you have anything to add to that?
Just one thing, can I say that?
Yes, please.
Just one thing that imagine a situation that Cheryl, that what you're presenting right now is the regular data. And then now imagine another situation. So look at the scale of this violence. And we would like everyone here to sort of be cognizant of that this is pre-COVID. And so violence is not because of COVID. COVID only escalated a situation. And so we need to be very, very cognizant that it's not that COVID caused violence. This is the pre-COVID data. And I don't know if there will be space for me to talk about India, because, but you have attitudes where, so intimate partner violence, yes. So I'm just saying, I was just talking to a doctor yesterday, and we got talking, and he said, you know, if domestic violence was an infectious disease, you will perhaps have a clinic at every road corner. So that's the level of pandemic that we are talking about. We're talking about a pandemic within a pandemic, but it's also referred to as a shadow pandemic, because we have enough data to say that every time there is a disaster or there is a health disaster, like this is not a disaster, but it's a pandemic, even during Ebola and even during other health pandemics, we have seen that women's violence against women went up and women's economic situations went down. And we can come back to that later. I have some data from India, but maybe I can come up with that later, and maybe Kalliopi can fit it.
Yes, thank you very much. If I can add very quickly, what we have to remember is that domestic violence and violence against women and girls is hugely underreported. So the numbers we have here being presented, they just present a very small number of cases, and the magnitude of the problem is much greater, I'm afraid. And also we have rates of domestic violence, but we have sexual harassment, for example, and the violence that women and the abuse that they face every day in the streets on their way to work is huge and hugely underreported. We don't have data. And what I really want to emphasize is that the domestic violence, especially during COVID-19, it is a pervasive form of violence, but we should not forget that a lot of women do not have the luxury to confine themselves in at home, and they very much experience other forms of violence. And usually these forms of violence, they intersect. So we have to do with violence against women in a continuum. Before COVID, as Poonam said, it's not that COVID created the violence, it exacerbated the risks and vulnerabilities.
Thank you both. That is such an important point. Thank you. And just add to that with this slide for your employer audience out there, I think it's also important to remember that women at all levels of education, economic status, workplace status, from the highest level of power in the workplace to the woman who may have just graduated from college, are all part of, it affects all women at all levels. So I think sometimes there's a misperception that it can just be women who are particularly vulnerable. Certainly vulnerable women are at great risk, but this affects all women in the workplace at all levels. So we can go on to the next slide there. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the power and control wheel. I realize that you may not be able to read this tiny little language, but for those of you who are not familiar with the dynamics of domestic violence, please download this, read this power and control wheel. It's been translated into many languages around the world and used by advocates everywhere to describe the dynamics of the most common form of violence, and that is coercive, controlling violence in intimate partner relationships. And you can see here how this wheel portrays how the physical violence and sexual violence reinforces all these kinds of coercive, controlling tactics that abusers use and are so important, I think, for the audience here, the employer audience, to understand how using emotional abuse and economic abuse and isolation, certainly during COVID, intimidation, are all part of what victims of domestic violence can be suffering at home and may not be visible. You may not see a black eye when a woman comes to the workplace. But this power and control dynamic goes on behind the scenes. So the more you understand about these tactics that are used, the better you'll be able to support your employees who are victims of violence in the workplace, whether they're working at home during COVID or, like Kalliopi so insightfully mentioned, those who don't have the privilege of working at home and have to be out in the public. So we can go on to any comments there, please. If the panelists have any comments, please jump in. I didn't particularly call on anybody, but if there's something you would like to mention in addition to that, with regard to the power and control wheel. Okay, we can go on.
Can I say something?
Please.
Just very quickly, because I think you mentioned power and control and the kind of abuses that happen. And since a whole lot of our people who are attending these seminars work with women agricultural farmers, and those are rural populations, just to say that women and there's documentation and research to prove that women in rural areas, they face isolation, they are isolated, survivor support services are very far, and the help is not necessarily at hand. So I'm just saying, you work with a population which perhaps faces much more of this vulnerability and they face much more violence compared to maybe other. We have data from India where urban women faced 24% violence as compared to rural women who reported 31.4%. So I'm saying this is again underreported, but we do have reason to think that the constituency that you work with maybe faces higher levels of violence and is not able to report.
Excellent. Thank you, Poonam. Okay.
Cheryl,
Yes.
I will also add a little bit on Mrs. Poonam. What you said is completely right. Representing a community of 120 women that we employ in the agricultural business, we are very knowledgeable of the very bad situation that these women are going through, because of being part of a vulnerable part of society. We also find out a very important topic is that most women don't understand, and even though they're suffering in this violence, they don't think there's another way out. They think this is the new normal. This is the normal of the way of living. So something to throw out there, that we might consider what violence is because we are aware of another reality, but there's women that are born in this circle and they think that this is right. And so it's very important to be aware of the big impact that we have as companies to transform societies. So yes.
Yes, thank you. We hear that so often in our work around the world. You know, there's such a disparity in around the world about the awareness that domestic violence is a crime, and some women just have never seen that information out there, been encouraged to report it, or seen it as anything other than their normal life. Thank you for that, Lorena. We can go on to the next place. The next slide here. Okay, good, wonderful. So just to bring it back to the workplace now, again, the impacts of domestic violence on the workplace. We know now, after 40 years of studying domestic violence, at least in the places where this movement began in the 1970s, the impacts on the workplace are profound. So the costs of domestic violence, from those dollars that we spend in our medical facilities, our legal facilities, the workplace cost in just the loss of ability to be productive, and the simple practical time that victims are taken from the work. All of these factors have been studied, and we know that this problem affects every aspect of women's lives and their performance, fulfillment. And in addition to the victims themselves, we have many examples of coworkers being harmed by abusers who are targeting not only their victims, but colleagues at work. Lorena, would you like to add to that? Commenting on the situation in Peru and
yes, definitely. It does become a big problem, especially for new companies. I mean, we've seen the agricultural business grow dramatically in Peru for the last 10 years. And this also applies to processing facilities of these fresh produce, the fresh produce that we work with. And what we've seen is that there's actually an increase of economical dependency of women in these new areas where processing facilities are being installed. And this definitely is giving them independence, but at the same time is bringing legal action against themselves because of different reports, different police reports. We found that local police reports before processing facilities, big processing facilities, were installed all around the coastline and around Peru, is that the reports were against, before the processing facilities, were against a man, but after the processing facilities being employing women, we found that all the reports were against women. So that's not meaning that women are becoming the aggressors, but they're definitely becoming victims of another strategy of violence. So there's definitely an economical impact when we've had situations in our company of women that sometimes want to work a little bit longer, and we have men outside of the processing facility, which if they're staying overtime, we have more than 5, 6, 7 men outside waiting for them. And sometimes the kids, that's what we saw before we installed our programs years ago, and we didn't know what the problem was. So there's definitely an impact with victims and in their families, of course, in societies, but for companies, it's really, you don't know why they're not coming to work. You don't know why productivity is coming down. And if you can pinpoint the problem, I think there's a great opportunity for not only for the company to have better performance, but definitely to impact lives. And that's what business is really for.
Really interesting point that you make, that as women gain power and men are challenged by that, we have seen this in other areas too. The violence can actually increase, or the manipulation of abusers, intent on manipulating the legal system. We've also seen, as policies go into place that are meant to protect victims, abusers will actually use those as other ways to oppress and manipulate.
And to add to that, we have to understand that in Peru, I mean, most of the police stations are run by men, and it's before we have great, like I said, we have great agricultural export business that has grown within the last decade here in Peru, and before, these men were either farming small pieces of land, or they were doing not a very stable job. So all of a sudden, having women with stable jobs year round brings them as head of household. And this is not only confronting physically the presence of violence, but economically, which I think sometimes for aggressors it's more complicated, because it touches their ego. So it's a little bit more, man is like, all I do is give food to the table. I give all this economical dependency to the family. If I can't give that, what can I do? So that increases violence. Economical empowerment can sometimes in vulnerable societies increase violence. So it's definitely an impact on all lines. So yes.
So interesting to constantly be thinking about that power dynamic, and how that is so important to so many men instill in defining their masculinity, and how, if that's threatened, that can have unintended consequences for women as women gain power. So thank you for that. I think Poonam had something to add here.
Just one thing, it was interesting to see this global cost of domestic violence is like an aggregated data, right? And so on the other side, you only have 0.29% being invested in survivor support services. It's the same set of data. Again, there's another UN Women study, and again global, but India is a part of that, where women lose for every episode of violence in India. For every episode of violence, a woman loses 5 days of work, paid work. And so the consequences of this on women, I think, are huge, because they tend to lose their jobs. And I was just reflecting back on one of my earliest colleagues very long ago, and her husband was violent and very jealous. And finally, she had to leave our job. And, I'm talking of something 25 years ago, and we didn't know how to deal with it that time. But I think when I reflect back, I see what happens to women when they face domestic violence. Employers think she's a troublemaker, she's problematic, her husband, why should I take this on? So all of that is bound to happen to women. And so we definitely, but there is a loss. There's a loss to the company, and there is a loss to the society.
Such a loss. Thank you, Poonam. Now, why don't we go on to the next slide. Why should employers get involved? So many reasons to get involved. Think about the impact that an employer in the position of being the woman's source of income and so close to her every day can have in just really being aware of what might be going on. Kalliopi, would you like to say a few things about this slide?
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. I think it is very important, as we said before, and all the panelists have identified the root causes of such violence. It is exacerbating the risks and vulnerabilities of women during COVID-19. And exactly because it's such a complex phenomenon, we cannot have only one actor preventing it and responding to such violence. And the importance of a comprehensive response to prevent violence against women and girls is by examining carefully the role of each actor. And workplaces and employers, they play a very important role as an entry point, sometimes the only entry point for some women in their lives. If I may say, exactly because of this important role that employers and private companies can play, that's exactly, it has been clearly articulated and recognized in international standards and international conventions, clearly as a fundamental issue of human rights, as you said before, Cheryl, but also recognizing the important role that the private sector can play. And we have the milestone global standard, the ILO convention, where it clearly recognizes the role of employers for the impact, to address the impact of domestic violence in the world of work. But also we have a lot of countries where they they have national legislation where they provide protection of employment, and they provide for workplace support systems, and they provide for paid leave days for victims of, for survivors of domestic violence. You have the duty of care in that slide, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
All you're
So
doing.
I think this is a very important point, the duty of care. You have all outlined so far very nicely the impact that domestic violence can have primarily on the individual survivors and women, for their health and for their general development, but also, as Poonam was saying, a lot of women, as a result of this domestic violence they suffer, they are forced to leave their employment. So that creates a vicious cycle of abuse, because they depend more on their abusers. So to define the duty of care, we really need to understand this impact that it has on private individuals, the survivors, on companies, as you very well have already outlined, because of lost productivity and lost days of work, etc. But it has an impact on other co-workers and also customers. And it poses very serious, beyond the cost for companies, also a very serious reputational risk and damage for the companies. So all this has been, it has a very serious impact pre-COVID situation. So you can imagine now, during COVID-19, where this violence has been exacerbated because exactly of the very specific circumstances of COVID and the policies in place to preserve social distancing. It makes it for survivors even harder to report. They don't know which services for them may be still essential ones, so they can go and report. They may be afraid, of course, of stigma, but also they may be afraid that they might be contracting the virus. They don't know where to turn for help. And also there is some serious, some higher safety and health risks for them that intensifies this duty of care for employers. All these facts that she cannot report, but also the fact that very often as a part of these controlling behaviors of the abusers, to keep the victims isolated from their networks and from their friends and from their extended families, they become very natural during COVID-19. But also what we have seen that their health and safety, it's directly affected because a survivor might be denied safety measures such as access to soap or hand sanitizers, or they don't have access to go to shopping in a supermarket or pharmacy, where we've seen in some countries they are offering support services. And also, it makes it much more difficult for managers and for employers to recognize the signs of abuse, as Lorena was saying before.
Mhm.
So all these things, I think they intensify the duty of care that employers have, especially during COVID-19. Over to you, Cheryl.
Interesting, really important comments when there just isn't access to all those other services that may be in place, not always are in place, but advocacy services and shelter services and legal, even the ability to go apply for an order for protection. So yeah, the employers are really taking, as you say, Kalliopi, an important role during this time, and an opportunity to learn from these dynamics are so just exacerbated right now that we can learn from them and take them into the future hopefully, if we ever get to post-COVID. Now, thank you so much, Kalliopi. I appreciate that. The next slides we're going to do we're going to talk about exactly this pandemic within a pandemic. We're going to call on all of you. Poonam, Louise, we really would like to bring you in here about France and Europe and understand this, but I want to check in with our chat, Laura. Just checking in with our chat here before we go on to these regional examples. There's Laura Wilson, our fabulous staff attorney at Global Rights for Women, and monitoring the chat box.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, we're having a great conversation in the chat, and there are a couple of questions. One is, they're kind of big picture questions, so they may be ones that you want to answer now or that you may want to kind of weave in, but the first one is how, going back to the power and control wheel, and maybe thinking of this in the context of what we're talking about with employers, how can we embed the understanding of power and control into policy developments and resource allocation so that we don't risk replicating the abuse of power? So for example, how can employers kind of use this understanding of power and control to empower survivors and I think we'll get into that more with specific suggestions, but if anyone has thoughts on that.
So I would like to say something here. With being in the ag business for so long, probably one of the challenges that you have in the agricultural business, as one of the participants said, one is the women work in the front lines, who are working in the front lines, live in either rural areas or depending on the country that you're based in, you are somehow in an immigrant position. So let's take the example of the US. A lot of women who are working in the front line, in the farm, in the packing houses, to a certain extent have non-immigration status. And I think that that's one of the complexities of being able to confront the issue of even the companies being aware and how to even manage this, right? Like, how do you report a domestic violence case against the police when you're not legally in the country? And bottom line, I just think it is ultimately just once again, it's creating that awareness and companies coming out of this space and taking a step towards creating a real action to this. Like many other industries in the world, the agricultural business, it's highly dominated by male in every single sector of the supply chain, whether you're a farmer, a packer, a shipper, a retailer, and so on. So I think that that's ultimately the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge that we have in our industry. When you think about, the global facts, is that women today, we are between 80 to 90% the ones who are making the purchasing decision at the store level. We are the ones who decide what do we eat, how do we eat, how do we feed our families, how do we feed our kids. But when you bring it back to where the actual problem starts, when we're growing these products, there's a tremendous lack of disconnect to really think about how are we servicing the women in the workplace, how are we helping her them to bring a lot more equality, a lot more resources to fight all of these items that we're discussing today. So the creating the awareness within those private companies, I think, is just it's a huge priority. And hopefully after this webinar, we're going to get a lot more of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie. Anybody else want to jump in and add? That's such a fabulous question about how to avoid recreating that power dynamic in the workplace.
May I come in quickly?
Yes.
I think it's very important, the points that Julie raised, having institutional change from within and creating an enabling environment where we have increased female managers, for example, and women in decision-making positions within our own organizations in order to move this agenda forward is important. Engaging the senior leadership to take this issue seriously and convey very specific messages to the employees' workforce and the other managers on how important it is to consider that, but also starting from our own selves and our own organizations by ensuring that we have a safe and open environment where we can listen better, where we can recognize abuse and power within our own selves and how we treat each other. I think to cultivate an environment which is respectful and that doesn't tolerate abuse and power in general, and raising awareness about that, I think it would be very important. And we have some models that we can share. Thank you.
Really important. Model the behavior you are promoting. Oh, so important.
Can I come?
Yes.
So it makes absolute business sense to work on prevention of violence within a business context. So that having said that, I do want to play a little bit of the devil's advocate because ultimately we have to see that this is a business and the employer is an entrepreneur, is not a social worker or a counselor. So what is that basic minimum that they want to do, which is just right to get the woman on the road to a violence-free life, but to ask them to, for too much of, let us say, what a counselor's role would be a little too much to expect. And I think so long as employers create an environment where women are free to talk about violence, are free to report, the employer has put up information and the employer refers the person to another service which is equipped for dealing with violence. I mean, for me, that would be the bottom line, because otherwise we are expecting too much from the industry and the industry may not be able to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought.
Okay, thank you, Poonam. Laura, were there others that you wanted to mention?
We have one follow-up question, and then we have a couple of others that I think we'll kind of get to. So I'm going to save those to the end in case, and I'll pose them then if we don't get to them. But I do have a question about going back to women with no legal status or women who are vulnerable for other ways. What are some strategies also for identifying other forms of violence against women, like women who are being trafficked, are sex workers, or experiencing disenfranchisement in some other way, especially if there are language barriers or other or immigration status barriers, things like that? Any suggestions?
Yeah, no, I think it really goes back to the bottom line of what we just mentioned here in the room. I agree. I think that for a company, for a private business, is very challenging, especially in today after COVID, as companies are trying to reinvent themselves of what's the new norm. There's been a lot of chaos in the last 3 to 4 months, a lot of disruption in the supply chain. But ultimately, it really comes down to the leadership team to say, if we are wanting to continue to keep our 30 to 40% of our workforce engaged and healthy, physically and mentally, we really need to put programs in place. And I think that the more we bring this real data to these companies and we educate them, then the more they're going to really sympathize, and where they're really going to enforce programs in place that allows these women to have a space to really have this kind of dialogue. And just very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a personal story that I got confronted with in my previous company. I had this export clerk. She worked under me for almost 3-4 years. Beautiful Mexican girl, absolutely gorgeous. I mean, you would just not even think that she would have gone through such a traumatic experience. And one day when I was sharing our initiative with Global Women Fresh, she said, "Hey, Julie, I would love to take you to lunch and share my story with you." And she said, by the time I was 13, I was working at the farm level. By the time I was 17, I was married. By the time I was 20, I had 2 kids. And by the time I was 21, my husband pretty much almost killed me. He beat me so hard that I ended up in the hospital with a big cut in my face, and her face was completely almost destroyed. And since then, you know, she got divorced. She realized that that was not a healthy environment. And the company that she worked for, which was the same company that I was working for, really did a good job within the leadership team to bring these women up, to provide tools to educate her. And 6 years forward, she was in a completely different space. So I think that it's just kind of, once again, it's having the sensibility to being able to open up a space within the private companies to listen to these women, and ultimately from there create some sort of a strategic alliances with these local entities that allows them to really work around giving them tools to have a voice and to have solutions around it.
Excellent, Julie. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's, that was great question, great responses. Let's move on to just some more dynamics about what we found. I mean, in the kind of the 2 to 3 months that we've all been in lockdown, there's now data coming out from the United Nations, the Population Fund. Secretary General has commented on the statistics that are being collected. Poonam and Louise, we could stay on this slide, or we could go to the next one, and talking in particular about the regions you come from. Would you like to jump in here, Louise?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen a huge increase in France in domestic violence, and also a huge increase in the number in the reports, which is somehow extremely worrying because of the numbers, but somehow also reassuring that people are reporting it. And what we've seen actually is, in France, a lot of the reporting has been done by neighbors, because we have a government website where reporting can be done by either victims or neighbors, and a huge amount of the reporting has been done by neighbors, which has then led by to interventions by police. So yeah, 36% more domestic violence complaints were filed to police. 14 women were killed during the lockdown, which in fact is less than the usual average. But I think we need to keep in mind that the separation of a woman victim of domestic violence is in fact the most dangerous moment of her life and her relationship with an abuser. And so, because the lockdown did not enable as many separations as could have been because of the situation, because people were physically unable to leave their houses without, in France, we needed a piece of paper which was signed and dated, and the reason of why we were leaving our house. So that means there's a lot of restrictions on movement, and I think it also creates a great atmosphere of fear. So a lot less separation, as could have been. And I think we need to be really vigilant in the next couple of weeks, because I think then that is the moment when women will start separating from abusers, and we will probably see a lot more domestic violence and extreme violence. So I think that's something we need to be careful about.
That is
Yeah.
so interesting, Louise. Now, France is opening up.
Yeah, so the end of the lockdown was the 11th of May, so exactly a month ago now. And 8 women have been killed since the 11th of May. So that's already almost as many as during the lockdown. So it just shows how dangerous the situation is at the moment.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing up that dynamic. And many on the call may not know that this is something that domestic violence practitioners are painfully aware of, is that when women do finally reach out for help in some way or leave the relationship, it's a very, very dangerous time, because that's, you know, the point where victim survivor is challenging the power of the abuser to keep control of her. So it's a, you know, sometimes just a difficult situation to manage and help, with all kinds of interveners in the community to manage that situation, help her get an order for protection, perhaps in a way that's safe though, and that she has a leading voice in that.
On the plus side though, in France, what we do is that instead of taking the woman out of the dangerous situation in which she is, the abuser is taken out. So instead of finding shelters for women, we find accommodation for abusers. And apparently an operation which usually takes 40 hours to do, to take the abuser out of his or her home, went down to 3 hours. So that's something to celebrate.
That is something to celebrate. Excellent. And that was due to COVID?
It was, yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. So good. Some promising practices coming out of this. Yeah, definitely a best practice to for civil order protection laws, for sure, to make sure that there is an immediate response by the legal system to take that abuser out of the home when the woman applies for an order for protection. There's imminent danger, and then the abuser is here in the United States, taken out of the home immediately, and then his rights are protected during a hearing that can happen in the next 7 to 14 days, where all the evidence can be considered. So thank you for that, Louise. And Poonam, did you have something to add there too? You've got some statistics on the slides here that are coming in, like Louise had noted for France, and then the other ones. I wanted to just note one quick thing. I did hear from some colleagues in the Balkans about how interesting it is. They're noting that in some places where there isn't a community, coordinated community response, that they just haven't developed that yet. The laws may be too new, training not sufficient yet, that reports have gone down because the women realize the community has no capacity to respond. So interesting dichotomy there.
So our experience is fairly similar. And I just want to add that obviously it's a stay-at-home situation and close proximity where people stay together for prolonged periods of time. The other thing that, like in India, 71% families stay in a one-room accommodation. So you can imagine what that can do to a family. And so when they are logged in with the abuser, this abuse obviously escalates. And you also have, it's also caused a lot of financial distress. We have a huge issue of migrant population, which went back to their rural villages and are jobless, are hungry. So, and there is high levels of unemployment that we are facing. So all of that is making the situation very complex. I just want to say this, that while this is the current situation, I think it's going to be long term. I think we are already talking, initially we started with saying life. So we're already talking with living with COVID. We see a 2-year time frame. It's no longer a 3 or a 6 month time frame. It's come to stay. So you are going to have a situation where things will open up. You'll have a lockdown situation again. We have seen that happening to Singapore, where they sort of opened up and then had to go back into a lockdown because the cases escalated. So I'm just saying that it's something that should now become the new normal, not the violence, but how to deal with excessive kind of violence or the kind of lockdown situations that may happen. Social distancing has come to stay. I mean, we faced a challenge of how do counsel, but our counselors are very used to sitting across a table and, empathizing. There's emotion, there's facial expressions, and people talk to each other. And we use our own bodies in a way to also give support. Suddenly, it's all about phone counseling. Suddenly, you're just talking to the woman from a distance. We have had cases where women went out to seek help, and there was a section 144 applied where it prevented more than 4 people from traveling, from getting together. So the police arrested the woman for stepping out of her house because she had come in to complain about domestic violence. So I'm just saying, so all of these have to be dealt with in this situation. Promising strategies, I think, yes, the National Commission of Women has a WhatsApp group where women can complain, but that's obviously a very class thing because not all women in India, I mean, we have a very high mobile phone penetration, but only 28% women have mobile phone access and only 16% of them have smartphones. So WhatsApp has a limitation there. Tomorrow, I think one of the very promising things that we have been able to pull through is we have something called the Niti Aayog, which is a replacement of the Planning Commission. It's a policy think tank. And tomorrow we are having a 1-hour webinar with them, a consultation with them to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on women in the country. So let's see, I hope that's a promising development.
Excellent. Hope a lot comes out of that. Thank you, Poonam. Yes, I'm getting a little note that how fast this time goes. I can never believe it. Let's move on here. And I think actually we have discussed the challenge. I think we've covered most of these so far. So why don't we keep moving if that's okay with everybody? I want to make sure that I say a couple words about this and then have any panelists. Global Rights for Women sits in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are carrying with us deep grief right now about the brutal murder of George Floyd. And we are aware now in a new way of the intersectionality of oppressions. And I just really encourage all of you on this call to increase your awareness about that. We know that certainly women are even pre-COVID certainly are reluctant to call the police here in the United States if they are in communities of color, immigrant communities, because of the police brutality problem. So other forms of vulnerability and oppression are real. And certainly this is something that all of us in positions of power need to incorporate into our knowledge, our practices, and the steps we take is this new understanding, I think, that's now really global about how deeply affected minority communities and people of color and oppressed communities are in a way that those of us with privilege can't understand. And take a moment of silence here. We're all very just devastated. Moving on to the next slide.
I just wanted to say one thing, Cheryl, that we have data from India that 60% of women who face domestic violence are from the unorganized sector. They work in low-paid, unregulated kind of occupations. And the challenges, I mean, you were talking of intersectionality of violence. We have covered most in terms of rural, tribal, single women, widows, older people. But I think particularly the unorganized sector goes completely uncovered or unprotected, doesn't have any safety net. And I think that's something that we should keep on thinking about.
Exactly, exactly. There's these challenges and oppressions there's a whole, I think are going to be revealed in a very new way in the coming months. That's certainly our opportunity now. Let's talk now about promising strategies in the workplace pre-COVID. Oh, did we get to there's a pre-COVID slide there, I think, Nazifa, that might come before this, or does that come after? Promising strategies in the workplace pre-COVID. Nazifa, do you see that one?
Should be up.
That one is promising COVID strategies. So I would love to talk, I'll talk, while you find that, I'll just talk briefly about it and invite the others. Here we go. So there are just some talking points here. There are a number of resources about strategies to support victims of domestic violence in the workplace, just in times where we're not in the kind of isolation we are during COVID. And here's some of the important points we've gleaned from reviewing a number of these strategies. You can please watch for the list of resources that we're going to send you on kind of model employer strategies for dealing with victims of domestic violence, for supporting victims of domestic violence. I love our Minneapolis ordinance here. It's called the Minneapolis Sick and Safe Time, and requires employers in Minneapolis to make sure that any absence due to domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking, the assistance is provided, and that policies are in place in the workplace so that domestic violence victims have time off to seek medical attention, to get services from a victim organization, to obtain counseling, to time off, to do what's required, sometimes the very time-consuming process of the legal system, and taking action and getting cooperating with a criminal case or getting an order for protection. Those are really important things that employers need to be aware that domestic violence victims need to do to keep themselves and their children safe. So here are a few others. Anybody want to jump in here?
I would love to, Cheryl.
You, Lorena.
Yes, so.
You have, yes, please talk about your strategies. Thank you.
A great job we've been doing with Women of Light Foundation. It's really important. At the end, we're all women of light, and we're trying to make this little light that we have inside shine brighter. So I think the word here is integrate. That's the big word of this era. We have to integrate. And we have to integrate within ourselves, you know, the physical, our mental, and our spiritual aspects. And that we can take it from a system. We can go and see in thinking in systems, not system thinking. We can go a little bit larger, and we can take it to our workplace. We can take it to our society. So I think if we analyze to implement either in formal or formal or informal areas, if we understand what the root cause of violence is, I think it's very, very important. The root cause of violence is fear. And so it's deeply rooted fear of losing power. So within our workplaces, we understand there are the victims are women. And if we integrate men within our companies to also collaborate with an organic change within the company, And once again, understand that we're talking about pre-COVID right now, but nothing was expected. I mean, we weren't expecting COVID, but one of the great things that taught us as humanity is that we are not prepared for crisis. We are living our lives like there's no, like there is many tomorrows. And we stop, and if we stop and evaluate these things as business owners, then we have to think, we always think about risk management. I mean, that's what we do on a daily basis. So if we take a step back now, we're forced to take 5 steps back, and we can reinvent ourselves, like Julie was saying. And this is a great opportunity, not only as businesses, as societies, but as a humanity, to integrate. And with this being said, what we've been doing from our perspective, from our foundation side of the house, implementing these programs that allow women and men to get in touch and integrate themselves has shown a dramatic increase of not only economical benefits, but social and well-being within the companies. So the programs that we had in place are called Yoga Break, and they don't go over 9 minutes. It's just very, very brief. You don't have to get into your sweatpants. That's what we're doing in companies. You don't have to actually move out of your desk. You can do it in your workplace, and just a pause that it's definitely needed. Just as COVID taught us, we sometimes need a pause to go within ourselves and to integrate and understand that as a system, we need to be integrated in order to have well-being. So by having programs like this in place, we've seen benefits all around. So that is something that I can share. And if there's any more questions on that, I'm very glad to be able to help. And but from our personal experience, it's been very, very, very good.
Excellent, Lorena, thank you very much. And we will have everybody's contact information up here on the next slide. So moving along, promising strategies in the workplace. Now we have, next slide there. Can we get that? Strategies in the workplace during isolation, excellent. So Kalliopi, would you like to comment on this slide?
Yes, thank you, Cheryl. I think you already, the main elements that you referred to for good promising practices pre-COVID-19, we have these main elements that we need to apply also in COVID-19 context. Of course, now we have a little bit more complex situation because managers, for example, they might not recognize easily the signs of abuse, and they might misunderstand the fact that an employee, for example, does not attend meetings, or she's not very much connected with other colleagues, or very much involved and engaged in work. Because, for example, managers, they might think that she's busy at home with the children, etc. So we need to train the managers of having about the heightened risk of domestic violence right now. So they need to pay some extra attention. Also, what we need to do, it would be very important to intensify the communication with our employees about the risk of violence, but also to make sure that we disseminate information about the availability of essential services to support survivors. Because what we have encountered in many countries is that very often survivors are not aware of which services are available, if there are any. So they don't have up-to-date information, and that would be very important to provide it through our companies. Just, I think for this group of participants and who attend the discussion, they might be interested in knowing that there are some good, promising practices that other companies, big companies, smaller companies, they have undertaken to address the challenges. For example, we've seen Vodafone. She's been the first private company that it introduced 10 days paid leave, safe leave as they call it, in order exactly what you said, Cheryl, before, to give the opportunity to the employees to seek for redress and support that they need. Also, we have in North America, we have Rio Tinto, for example, that they have issued specific safety guidance for employees working at home. And actually, an element, a practice that I found quite interesting is they identify that if an employee needs the safety of the workplace, for example, to escape abuse and violence at home, then the manager can designate this employee as an essential office worker, for example, and give her the opportunity to be in the workplace, of course, with all the safety protocols that we need to keep. And I think for this group of people, and I know that you have already joined forces to do that, we've seen, for example, that companies have created networks and campaigns using social media and other technology platforms to raise awareness about availability of services, but also to raise resources for support services for survivors. So they were doing fundraising for support services as well. And I think at this point, more than ever, solidarity and how we join forces to address these issues would be really important.
Excellent, excellent, Kalliopi. Thank you so much. On a different angle, I just have to ask Louise to talk the grocery industry strategy in France. Would you mention that, Louise?
Of course. So in fact, it was a measure that was encouraged by the State Secretary for Equality between Women and Men. And she called upon a registered organization who tackle domestic violence to set up in grocery stores, supermarkets, and department stores safe spaces where women and children and men also, I'm sure, could go and disclose violence and were offered support. These were, well, they were registered organizations, so they were trained people. And then that led to certain measures taken to the police and arrests as well. About 500 people, I think, sought help throughout this device. So it was quite successful. And it may be continued even post-COVID. So that's quite interesting. Yeah, and it was implemented extremely rapidly within the first few weeks of the confinement.
Excellent. So we are now on slide, let's see, what can you do next, I think is where we are. And we have 5 minutes, so these are some good bullet points you can take away with you. We are available for your reaching out to all of us. Lorena, did I cut you off on something regarding the workshops done with the government sectors, or did you cover that?
It's basically our program of Yoga Break, and okay. I can briefly just add sure. a great quote that I always start my classes with, and I think it's amazing for this moment as well. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, and I really need to. I can't stress enough the fact that we really need to change and help other people change the way they see things in order to have a solution that will include everybody. We need to understand we're also part of the problem in order to find a solution, because we are part of the same society. We're not excluded. So that's pretty much the basics of the technologies that we've been applying in the public sector. And it's been very self-rewarding to see people smiling and having better quality of lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to put it. You know, we have to understand we're part of the problem, and boy, if we haven't learned that in the last couple of weeks after the murder of George Floyd with the police brutality, there's an opportunity for us to open our minds and understand that we need to be in a different place to find a solution. Back to this slide here, and know certainly in view of that, all of that, there are experts in this field that have been working on domestic violence directly with victims like Louise, at the policy level like others. Reach out to them, and they will have just insights in to help you change your place that your brain is, and help you develop workplace policies that can better support victims. And then we're here. We can connect with panelists to learn more and request a workshop for your company. I think we can go to the next slide and show our, I think there's some contact information there, and certainly we would love to stay connected with you. We are going to send out the PowerPoint slides. I know there have been a lot of questions about that with these resources. We are also going to wrap up this PowerPoint or this webinar by following up with a resource sheet that has listed some of the pre-COVID workplace strategies to support survivors of violence, and then those we're learning during COVID. So with that, we have 4 more minutes. Do any of the other panelists want to say anything in closing?
Well, this is once again Julie. So I just want to thank everyone, the panelists, and the global audience. And from a Global Women Fresh perspective, we're extremely committed on this initiative. I think it is definitely a wake-up call for private companies to be able to have more initiatives around this. And feel free to connect with me. My email and my contact information is in the presentation. And likewise, we look forward to continue to work with Global Rights for Women. It's as Lorena said, I mean, I think it's part of, it's not going to go away in a day. There's a lot of work that needs to be done globally. But the fact that there is a group of women committed, and women and men committed to make a change and creating the new norms is the opportunity that we had ahead of ourselves. So thank you, Cheryl, for all these great platforms.
And huge thanks to you, Julie, for this idea of doing this webinar together. And
Can I say something very quickly? First of all, thank you very much. That was a very interesting discussion. Just to share the information that UN Women has, the Women Economic Empowerment Principles, and a very good network of private sector organizations that they have been engaged very much with UN Women for certain principles on how to support their employees, including for domestic violence. I'm going to share the details with the organizers. So this network that hasn't ended today, they might want to consider, because also we have a lot of resources there for broader gender equality frameworks, how to create this enabling environment within our own companies and help our employees and our managers. So I will do that. And thank you very much. I personally learned a lot.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kalliopi.
Thank you.
So anyone else, quickly? Thank you all so much. Your panel, you women that have joined us for the panelists, they've all donated their time. We're so grateful to you. We're so grateful to all of you who joined us and care about and prioritize this issue. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.